Uh, Thanks so much to all of you for joining us on what I know is a very busy day. You've tuned into the Creating an Economy That Works for All webinar that is sponsored by the American Sustainable Business Council, which is a business organization representing several 100,000 companies that focus on progressive public policy. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation. Please put those questions in the chat section of the Zoom recording. Today we have a wonderful panel with me. Mary Ann Howland is the president and CEO of IBIS Communications and also a board member and chair of the ASBC Race and Equity Working Group. We have Wendell Potter, president of Business Leaders for Healthcare Transformation. Fred Alexander, the former head of legal policy at B-Lab and now the founder of the Shareholder Commons. Chris Liu, former Deputy Secretary, Department of Labor. And Michael Alden Peck, the executive director and co-founder of One Worker, One Vote. My name is Jeffrey Hollender, and I am the co-founder and CEO of the American Sustainable Business Council. And as I said, very happy to be with you today. The COVID-19 crisis, together with the outrage about ongoing racism in America, has revealed what many of us have always known. Our current system of capitalism is broken and does not work for most Americans. As Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Stephen Pearlstein recently wrote, our economic system has run off the moral rails, offending our sense of fairness, eroding our sense of community, poisoning our politics, and rewarding values that easily degenerate into greed and indifference. This dysfunction was clearly recognized by a recent Harris poll, where 75% of Americans said that our current form of capitalism doesn't ensure the greater good of society. And only 29% of Americans believe it produces the kind of society they want for the next generation. Back in December of 2019, which seems like a very long time ago, ASBC launched its work on creating an economic system that works for all at its Washington, D.C. summit. And in March, ASBC launched its multi-stakeholder working group. This working group has identified the most important business-related public policies required to create an economy that works for all. And we'll be discussing some of those policy initiatives today. ASBC initiated these conversations because while capitalism remains a dynamic force, challenges such as income inequality, crumbling infrastructure, market consolidation, climate change, underinvestment, and the financialization of our economy pose serious threats to our continued global leadership, social and environmental sustainability. Many across the company view our current capitalist system as rigged and not working for them. In recent history, management of business has focused on maximizing value for themselves and their shareholders. But a growing chorus of finance experts has argued that this narrow focus has come at great cost to customers, employees, suppliers, and communities who have a large stake in our economy. If our economy is to work for all, then business leaders have to implement ways to simultaneously address the priorities of all stakeholders, not just their shareholders. This critical transition will also require many changes in culture, compensation, ownership, and the careful measurement of business performance, as well as the passage of public policies that are based on serving the needs of all stakeholders. Such is our task, challenge, and focus today. Racial equity must also be a foundational part of any public policy recommendations that seek to create an economy that works for all. One of the critical benefits of diversifying our economy and fighting systemic racism is captured by a report that analyzed consumer spending, which from the racial gap that we have in the US would generate an additional $191 billion spent on food, $500 billion spent on housing, $52 billion spent on apparel, and many, many more dollars spent by people that are today disenfranchised by our current economic system. The elected leaders working with business and other stakeholders must craft with us policies that address these challenges we face. And the ASBC Council is committed to influencing policies, policymakers, and regulators on economic, environmental, workplace, and social issues that foster a broad-based prosperity. What is required is a bold, integrated approach to complex, comprehensive, systemic change, along with advocating for, and I'm just going to touch on a few of them because our panel will be addressing them as well, is limiting the corporate takeover of our political process by limiting the use of lobbying and money in politics. An important concept called full cost accounting that is necessary to ensure that companies measure and account for the externalities that are presently shouldered by society and the environment. We must work towards the development of full cost accounting, which has been stewarded in part by a project at the Harvard Business School under the leadership of George Safarim. Improved governance is also required, and the active enforcement of antitrust legislation to prevent business monopolies that raise prices and create unfair competition. We must also invest in clean technology manufacturing, restrict stock buybacks by large companies, and increase taxes on wealthy individuals through a wealth tax. We have many, many more things that we'll be touching on today, and I want to now kick off this seminar by letting Fred Alexander speak about the public policy issues related to corporate governance and increased fiduciary responsibility. Fred?
Jeffrey, thanks a lot. That's a fantastic introduction, and I just, as you walked through all that, I could hear just like every issue that we're facing and the difficult issues that we're facing. And what I want to talk about are not sort of all the specific elements of regulation that are necessary to keep business like within proper lanes, but rather a sort of a concept of what it means to own and steward capital through the financial system. And I think, this is the ASBC business, so that to some extent, we're all capitalists and we all believe in markets and using those markets to allocate and price resources. And we understand that we've tried the other version, the command economy throughout history, and those haven't worked too well. So we're all sort of believers that by using markets, you can create a lot of value. But I think what we're coming to understand more and more every day is that even though the profit motive can lead to value creation, profits do not equal value. They're good profits that come from innovation and efficiency, and they're not so good profits that come from exploitation of common resources and vulnerable populations and exploitation of power relationships. And those aren't good, and they hurt all of us. And what we really need to do, and we have a financial system that sort of still looks at profits as the perfect rule of thumb for creating value. And as a result, we have things like fiduciary duties of directors, where the focus of directors continues to be, and it's a combination, I would say, of law and cultural norms, but you're successful when you create a lot of profits and your stock price goes up. You're not considered successful if that doesn't happen. And the same thing happens at the portfolio level with asset managers, with asset owners like pension funds and wealth funds and mutual funds. And so what we need to do in order to address this issue is to change the rules that govern all those fiduciaries. Because if you think about it, private capital is perhaps the most powerful force in our economy right now, more powerful than government. It governs like 80% of spending decisions that are made in the US and similar economies. And those decisions right now flow through an economic system where people put their money into mutual funds or pension funds, or they put them into banks, and those financial intermediaries reinvest them, and they flow down through a series of advisors and asset managers, whether it's BlackRock or a proxy advisor or an investment bank, and eventually make it to the real economy. But right now, all those fiduciaries are, ultimately judged by the returns they make. And what we need to do, and we have the ability to do through legislation and regulation, is to shift the purpose of managing assets, and not shift them so that the idea isn't to make a profit, but shift them so that the idea is to make good profits. So in other words, we want to take exploitive profits off the table. So if we can change the fiduciary duties of asset managers, of corporate directors and executives, of asset owners, to say, yes, your job is to take the savings that you're shepherding and earn the best return you can, that's fine, but it has to be the best return within a set of guardrails so that workers are not being exploited, the environment is not being exploited, we don't continue like all the injustices that our economy is built on. And this can be done. We're working on a white paper at the Shareholder Commons, where I'm the CEO, along with B-Lab. And appendix to that white paper is going to suggest an entire suite of federal regulation that would alter fiduciary duties up and down that investment chain. And in addition to changing fiduciary duties, would change disclosures and the procedures that shareholders and others could use to enforce those duties, so that we would have a market economy where we still use the profit motive to allocate resources, still used it to price goods and services, but at the same time, we would limit the use of that power to good that benefited, as you've said, an economy that works for everybody. And that's our proposal, and that's has been our contribution to the ASBC legislative work product.
Thank you so much, Rick. Let's go next to Marianne Howland.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey, and fellow business leaders. Good afternoon from Nashville, Tennessee. Well, everyone, this is our moment during a health crisis that has a death toll of over 170,000 souls and rising, that continues to fuel an epic economic collapse. We are moved to pray with our feet, as John Lewis would say, in an ongoing march in what has become the largest global protest against injustice in history. What has appeared in stark relief are the ravages of classism and systemic racism. We now have the crystal clear definition of who are our essential workers, the vulnerability of businesses, and the severe impact on minority-owned businesses in particular, and our communities. We see the impact of classism and systemic racism on jobs, wages, food, and healthcare as we witness home evictions and day-long food lines. The question we have to ask ourselves is this who we want to be? Can we be better, do better? We know we can. We did in 2009 when Barack Obama and Joe Biden brought us out of what was then the worst recession since the Depression and set us on a steady path of economic growth for the longest period in history. They saved the auto industry and saved tens of thousands of good-paying jobs and related businesses. The impact on minority communities and minority-owned businesses was exponential. Today, a recovered auto industry was able to pay back America by mass production of masks desperately needed to protect Americans during this pandemic. Think about that. The American Sustainable Business Council Race and Equity Working Group was created to address the inequities prevalent and pervasive in the economic and social construct of the United States, and to hold our legislators on both sides of the aisle accountable to racial and economic justice. We ensure that the dignity and respect of diverse perspectives, voices, and values of a multicultural America are heard and reflected in our policy work toward creating an equitable and compassionate economy for all. We collaborate with ASBC's policy team to gather support on issues that have a disparate impact on minority communities, African Americans, Latinx, Asian Americans, Native Americans, LGBTQ, our veterans, and people with disabilities. From climate to healthcare to infrastructure, we represent founders of minority-owned businesses and the voices of representatives of organizations who are committed to a movement for racial equity and justice on critical issues such as access to capital, investment inequality, and community investment, such as the Save Our Streets Act, which is groundbreaking legislation led by Senator Kamala Harris and Representative Ayanna Pressley that provides federal support to micro businesses through America during the COVID-19 crisis, and the Climate Equity Act, a platform for an asset-based approach to building equity and racial diversity with new business opportunities and new jobs. Business leaders in the Race and Equity Working Group are confronting racism, fighting for policies such as cleaning up the environment, a fair minimum wage, and paid leave for hardworking families, and fighting against racist policies in our local communities, such as redlining that has segregated communities and thus controls opportunity through the systematic denial of services by federal government agencies, local governments, as well as the private sector. We are at work on police reform that protects the rights and the lives of citizens and represents the interests of socially responsible businesses. We are working on federal policies, including Biden's disability policy to end sub-minimum wages for disabled workers, a review of state guardianship laws, and tackling racial disparities in special education, and exploring new ideas like accessible childcare and entrepreneurship. We are focusing on investor responsibility. When firms owned by women and minorities combined manage just 1.3% of assets in the $70 trillion asset management industry, we have work to do to improve representative numbers of Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, and women in positions of decision-making power in all sectors, but especially in the financial markets. This includes boards, C-suites, asset allocators, and fund managers. When we achieve equal representation in leadership positions, we will be able to identify community-centered business solutions that are logical and meaningful for our future. We are working on racism in the food system. Food justice includes development of urban agriculture projects and neighborhood kitchens, and economic development initiatives to relocate healthy grocery environments in low-income communities. Food justice includes the guarantees that fair proportions of public funding from the USDA and some states will flow to farmers of color and women who have traditionally been excluded due to documented and adjudicated acts of racism or sexism. Food justice includes land grants to farmers of color who have been systemically kept from owning land or had their land stolen. And our highest priority right now is protecting the election and election reform, starting with restoring the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, ending voter suppression, reinstating voting rights to ex-felons, ending gerrymandering, and taking money out of politics to rebalance our politics and government by putting the rights of individual citizens before the privileges of concentrated money, corporations, unions, political parties, and super PACs. As chair of the ASBC Race and Equity Working Group, I co-lead the track on protecting the election. Voting is the most important right we need to exercise, especially in this election, now more than ever before. We are encouraging businesses to encourage their employees to vote however they choose. These are people of color. Attorneys general are building multi-state, in some cases, bipartisan coalitions targeting areas like consumer protection and public health. When companies are seeking to resolve legal issues connected with state investigations and litigation, representation matters. We invite you to join us in learning more about what we can do to ensure our voices are heard, as well as creating a more inclusive government. We will be co-hosting our next public forum on protecting the election and an inclusive America on August 27 in a live Zoom event. And more information is available at our website. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. Thank you so much for that insightful talk. Next up is Chris Liu. Chris?
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a double honor to be with all of you today. I am both an ASBC board member. I'm also a Democratic convention delegates. So on behalf of the DNC, let me thank all of you for being part of this week's festivities. I know we all wish we were in Milwaukee right now, but it's empowering to see so many people come together in this virtual setting. I was privileged to have many jobs in government, but I have to say that my favorite was serving as the Deputy Secretary of Labor under President Obama. And one of the reasons why I love that job so much is that it gave me the opportunity to spend time with companies that were working hand in hand with their employees to create a shared prosperity. These were companies that were embracing the high road because they understood that high road practices are good for all of their stakeholders. It's good for owners, employees, and for customers. And when I would travel around the country and meet with companies, I met with so many business leaders who told me time and time again that their most valuable asset was their employees. And it's one of the reasons why high road employers, business leaders have understood that providing paid leave helps recruit and retain women. But what's remarkable is that until recently, no one has actually tried to quantify what the impact of paid leave policies are. And that's why I was so happy that ASBC last November released a study that for the first time put a monetary value on paid family leave policies and found that companies with paid leave policies average increases of about 4.6% in revenue and 6.8% in profits. So it's not only good for recruiting and retaining employees, it's ultimately good for the bottom line. And again, over the past 6 months, the pandemic has laid bare the importance of paid leave, as now more than 5 million people have been infected with COVID-19. Lastly, at the DNC this week, we'll be talking a lot about good paying jobs. We're talking about how to lift people into the middle class. And we have to recognize that one of the easiest ways to lift workers is to make it easier for them to join unions and to help improve the bargaining power of unions. I'm always struck by the fact that a union job on average pays about $200 per week more than a non-union job. And in industries where we have more unionized workers, unions can actually bring up the pay and benefits, not just for their own members, but for everyone in that industry. So these are some of the critical policies that we are looking at ASBC. And while the last 3.5 years have certainly been discouraging in terms of getting action from the White House and the Senate on these initiatives, what has been so encouraging is that when it comes to paid leave, when it comes to higher wages, so many cities and states are taking action on their own. And so many companies, just as importantly, have begun to adopt these policies because they understand that the high road is the smart road, and it's critical not only to growing their businesses, but to creating a more prosperous economy. Thank you.
Next up is Wendell Potter. Wendell?
Jeff, thank you very much. And thank you all. It is a great honor to be a part of this, and greetings from Philadelphia. You've heard some of the numbers that I'm going to mention in a minute. But as you hear them, I want you to keep in mind that I'm talking about real human beings. People like Jill Eicher of Maryland, who I learned about by going to GoFundMe and typing in the words high deductible. I found thousands of people like Jill. People who have insurance, but who have to worry not only about a deadly disease like cancer, but also about bankrupting their families because they're sick. Remember, Jill and thousands of others who are begging for help on GoFundMe have health insurance, and many of them still have jobs. Thousands of others who've lost their jobs this year are also having to turn to GoFundMe in the United States of America. Since the beginning of this pandemic, 46 million US workers, maybe more, have lost their jobs, at least temporarily. 10 million or more of those jobs are not likely to come back anytime soon, if ever. An estimated 5.5 million of those workers also lost their health insurance, but that number is actually misleading. That's because most of those workers have families. So now those workers and their families have been forced into the ranks of the uninsured. Those are numbers you've probably seen or heard in recent months. Here are some facts and figures that haven't made as many headlines, but they are every bit as alarming. The pandemic has laid bare just how broken our healthcare system still is. 10 years after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, which I supported and fought for, and which has done a world of good. But one very big thing that was failing us when the law was passed, and is failing us far more now, is our employer-based system of health insurance. In 1998, the total number of people covered by employer-based insurance was 156.1 million. 20 years later, 20 profits in their history. If that doesn't piss you off, folks, I don't know what will. And Jeffrey, you mentioned share buybacks. Since 2007, the largest for-profit insurance companies, including Cigna and Humana, where I work, have bought back collectively more than $100 billion of their own shares. Insurance companies have been posting record profits since the ACA was passed. I knew that would happen, and I warned Congress back in 2009. In fact, Speaker Pelosi invited me to talk to House leaders in 2009. I said then that if Congress passed the ACA without a strong public option, they might as well call their bill the Health Insurance Industry Profit Protection and Enhancement Act. Even President Obama himself said that the public option was needed to, quote, keep insurance companies honest. As we all know, the ACA did pass without a public option because my old industry spent hundreds of millions of dollars to kill it. And now that they're—
Thank you so much, and an honor to be on the panelists with everybody. Here are 6 thoughts for a stakeholder economy blueprint. First, let's flatten both COVID and inequality pandemic curves concurrently. No healthy economy without a healthy people is more than a mantra. It's really the pandemic survival Magna Carta. COVID-19 exposes that essential workers are often BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and because largely misclassified as independent contractors, are denied the protections and benefits of formal employment desperately needed now more than ever. Many workers are finding unemployment and emergency relief benefits difficult to access, and companies have not paid into safety net systems. Second, worker ownership as the first mover app for the stakeholder economy. Metrics show broad-based worker-owned social enterprises and ecosystems are more stable, inclusive, equitable, democratic, resilient, and competitive, with fewer job losses, especially during downturns. Research reveals that combining an equity stake with participatory ownership culture, essentially the definition of a worker cooperative, creates upwardly transformative, shared purpose-driven businesses and societies. The basic democratic principle valued in nation states and stakeholder economy enterprises is one human, one vote. An equity share is the right to vote and provides the basis for power paradigm changing culture, leading to flatter curves, facilitating more equally fulfilled lives and dignified retirements. Third, advancing stakeholder economy culture. Almost a year ago, last September, the U.S. Business Roundtable discovered the downside of shareholder primacy, and last February, the World Economic Forum in Davos discovered stakeholder capitalism. This is all about uplifting and transforming the culture of capitalism, flattening those curves, shortening the long arc of justice, opportunity, and freedom to self-actualize. Pandemic winner and loser countries show daily that everything is downstream from culture. Better results require better culture, and culture is not plug and play. It's organic and purposeful. Fourth, strategies. We can start by recognizing and organizing the growing divide between worker ownership and employee ownership communities. They used to be more or less the same, but no more. The Census Bureau estimates America's multiracial population will triple by 2060. In early 2019, a year before the COVID explosion, the McKinsey Global Institute reported that the search for low-cost labor was no longer a primary driver of global trade. Less than 20% of goods traded today is based on companies seeking the lowest wages around the world. The new focus is on higher collaborative skills by an empowered, self-actuating workforce. Conversions. Increasingly, both social impact and traditional hedge, pension, private equity investors seek to finance worker takeovers of companies for uplifting social reasons when stakeholder-owned firms' superior resiliency and performance improve returns. For social impact capital investors, The S for social in ESGs, environment, social governance metrics, dominates and is based on resiliency algorithms. Resiliency and stakeholder ownership are inseparable. One provides the roots and rationale for the other. Fifth, tactics. Let's invent more hybrid, inclusive shared ownership models, combining and integrating union co-ops, benefit corporations, democratic ESOPs, ESOPeratives. This is America's comparative advantage, hyphenated and hybrid, but only when the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, when it's e pluribus unum, not I did it all myself. Globally, let's push the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, to add worker ownership as goal number 18. Domestically, current tax law must be changed in the direction of tax parity, making tax benefits more uniformly accessible and equal for all worker ownership models and therefore investor agnostic. This way, America's hosting communities and their emerging local worker owners, stakeholders shouldering these new enterprises will have the freedom to choose the model and approach best culturally suited for them. Culture drives profitable returns on balance sheets, just like in real life. Let's support California's Cooperative Economy Act, CEA, that empowers workers as owners. An economy that works for all must envision a new form of labor market intermediary, representing a new employment paradigm where both traditional employees and gig workers not only receive employment protections, but also own and govern their workplaces. The CEA defines a new class of worker, a cooperative labor contractor status that protects workers, adds worker ownership, provides employment protections and benefits, such as minimum wage, paid sick leave, and unemployment, and accelerates misclassified workers' economic recovery from both pandemics, COVID, and structural inequalities, including racism. Sixth, conclusions. This is good trouble capitalism, and it's domestically and globally profitable. In a good trouble stakeholder economy, doing well by doing good makes sure the common good is upfront, inclusive, ubiquitous, intergenerational, and place-based. Speaking truth to power is healthy, uplifting those whose voices are finally heard, respected, reenfranchised, and reincorporated, center stage and center ring. But speaking truth from power is where we're going. Our emerging stakeholder economy rejects a trickle-down plantation economy and delivers intentional, bubble up and gusher up formulas, motives, behavior, and outcomes. We must ask ourselves, how many more needless deaths and how many more lost jobs will it take before America undertakes a higher mission? You know, the one where how much more we need each other is in itself a more perfect business, a more perfect societal construct, and a more perfect civic union. Thanks.